I know from your sort of your top end workings in journalism, you got to be around some of the, I mean, literally some of the biggest corporate leaders that have ever walked the planet. You've interviewed a lot of them on this podcast. But how did you go from journalists digging for the gold within other people to going, actually, here's a system and a process that could work for a lot of critical thinking for other top leaders?
The zombie movie.
Very good zombie movie. Which one was it? I'm
World War Z, or World War Z, as you would say.
As we would call it, yeah.
Are you familiar with it?
I am, yes.
So I gotta preface this, James, by saying that I'm not a fan of zombie movies generally, and I'm not a fan of horror movies in general. But when World War Z or World War Z came out, which I think was around 2013 timeframe, we'll put the actual date in the show notes. Several friends of mine whose opinions I valued told me, you got to see this. It's the thinking man zombie movie. Now, that seemed like an oxymoron to me. And while I valued their opinion, I didn't value it enough to actually go to the theater and watch the movie. But a few months later, it popped up on as a new release on my streaming service, and I was homesick one day. And I said, well, there's worse ways to kill an afternoon. So I started watching it. And as you know, because you saw the movie, typical zombie apocalypse story, there's a zombie plague starts in India and spreads rapidly around the world and, destroys every country in the world except Israel. Israel is the only country that's still left standing, at least at an early point in the movie. And so our hero, Brad Pitt, is sent by what's left of the U.S. government, which at the time is operating off of, an aircraft carrier off the east coast of what used to be the United States, to Israel to find out what did they know that no one else knew? Why were they the only country in the world that dodged this bullet? And he lands in Jerusalem, and he's picked up at the airport by a leader of Israeli intelligence, and he asks him that question. And what the guy says is, and we'll put a clip of this in the notes because there's a great clip of this. He explains to Brad Pitt that they have something called the 10th man concept, and the 10th man doctrine. And the 10th man doctrine is something he explains that they came up with after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which they almost lost. And they almost lost it, he explains, because they didn't challenge their own thinking, their own assumptions. And so to make sure that never happened again, they created something called the 10th man doctrine. And the 10th man doctrine is real simple, he explains. If all of us on the Israeli Security Council believe something is true, it's the job of the 10th man to argue the opposite is true. And so he says, just like every country in the world, we got this bizarre signals intelligence from India talking about this plague and zombies and everything. And just like every country in the world, we were inclined to totally disregard it. But I was the 10th man. And so I said, what if it's true? What if this is really happening? And we sealed our borders. And that's how come the zombies are not in Israel. Well, as you know from the movie, it doesn't really matter. 5 minutes later, the zombies are at the Wailing Wall. But it mattered a great deal to me because at the time I had just, a year or two before written my first book, American Icon, Alan Mullally and the Fight to Save Ford Motor Company. And I had quit my job as a journalist in order to teach companies how to implement Alan's management model. And one of the things I was struggling with, that I had been struggling with, James, since I was a journalist, was how do you get people to challenge their assumptions? How do you get people to think about the unthinkable? How do you get people to overcome complacency? And so when I saw this clip, I just was like, this is amazing. Is this true? Is there such a thing as the 10th man doctrine? Because if it is, businesses need this. And my mind started going to all these business cases where you could apply it. I started thinking about, what if there'd been a 10th man at Ford or General Motors or Chrysler in the United States in the early 1970s when the Japanese cars first started coming in mass to the US. And instead of sitting around the boardroom, smoking their cigars and joking about, how Americans are never going to buy these little tin cans. They want big cars, the V8 engines and stuff. What if somebody had sat at the table and said, fine, but what if they do? What if this is exactly what Americans want? What if they do buy these cars? What are we going to do? How different would the world have been in that scenario? And so when I got better, I did what anyone would do, James. I got on the internet and went looking for an Israeli intelligence officer to find out if it was real.
Thank you for tuning in to The Thinking Leader. Check the show notes for more information about the topics covered in this episode. There, you'll also find a link to our free assessment. Click on it right now to find out if you are a red team thinker with a red team culture.